It was 7 in the morning on March 15th, 2025 in Denver, and the kitchen smelled of bacon and toast. I was standing by the counter grinding beans for coffee, trying to get my head clear before another long day at the construction site. Rachel was by the stove turning eggs in a pan, her hair tied back still in her robe. Ethan sat at the table with his backpack beside him scrolling on his phone, and Sophie was bent over a bowl of cereal, humming to herself. It was the ordinary noise of our mornings, the only time I felt the house belonged to us. Then Linda walked in. She never knocked, never hesitated. At 65, she carried herself like the queen of the house, even though she had moved in with us after her husband died. Her heels clicked against the tile floor, and her presence always sucked the air out of the room. She looked at me, narrowed her eyes, and her lips curled. "You are still here, useless as ever," she spat. 7 in the morning and you think coffee makes you a man. Rachel froze at the stove, the spatula shaking in her hand. Ethan glanced up quickly and then back to his phone. Sophie lifted her spoon and lowered it again without a word. I felt the blood rush to my ears, but I kept my back straight. I had heard it all before, the insults about being lazy, about not being enough for her daughter, about not earning enough, about not being a real man. But this time was different. She stepped closer, her perfume mixing with the smell of frying eggs, and she raised her hand. The crack echoed in the kitchen as her palm struck the side of my face. My cheek burned instantly, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt. I did not move. I did not raise my hand. I stared at the wall and listened to the silence that followed. Rachel whispered, "Mom, please," but her voice was weak. She looked at me, then at her mother, torn between loyalty and shock. Ethan shifted in his chair, his teenage face caught between anger and confusion, not sure if he should stand up or stay quiet. Sophie dropped her spoon, the clatter loud in the silence, and her small eyes filled with fear. I wanted to gather them up to shield them, but I stood still, breathing, my hand gripping the edge of the counter. Linda sneered. "You cannot even defend yourself," she said, and turned toward Rachel, as if waiting for support. Rachel lowered her eyes and said nothing. The shame of that moment pressed down heavier than the sting on my cheek. I looked at my son and saw the question in his eyes, the question of what kind of man lets himself be treated this way. I looked at my daughter and saw her innocence crack the realization that adults could be cruel inside their own family. I swallowed hard. The clock ticked on the wall. The bacon sizzled and began to burn, smoke rising from the pan. Rachel rushed to turn off the stove, her hands trembling. Ethan pushed his phone aside and clenched his fists under the table, but he stayed silent. Sophie reached for her glass of milk, her fingers shaking so badly she spilled it. The white liquid spread across the table and dripped onto the floor. Nobody moved to clean it. Linda pulled out a chair and sat down as if nothing had happened. She smoothed her skirt and took the plate Rachel had placed for her. Her face was calm, almost satisfied. She cut into the eggs and ate while the rest of us stood frozen in the storm she had just created. I pressed my tongue against the inside of my cheek, where the skin stung, reminding myself not to speak, not yet. Every part of me wanted to shout, to slam my fist into the table, to throw her out. But my children were watching. I could not let them see me lose control. "Not like this," Rachel finally said softly. "Michael, sit down, please." Her voice cracked. She wanted to pretend breakfast could go on, that the moment could be erased, but there was no erasing what had just happened. Ethan stood up suddenly, pushed his chair back, and left the table. His footsteps stomped down the hallway. Sophie looked at me with wide eyes, her cereal soggy and untouched. Rachel kept her gaze down, ashamed of both of us. Linda chewed slowly, and smiled faintly, as if she had won. I sat down without touching my coffee. The bitter taste of humiliation filled my mouth. I forced myself to breathe evenly, my chest tight, my hands steady on the table. I knew if I spoke, then my words would come out like fire uncontrolled. So I waited. I stared at my plate and listened to the fork scrape against Linda's teeth. My children would remember this morning, I thought. They would remember whether I collapsed under the weight of her cruelty or whether I rose above it. The choice was mine, and I had already made it in silence. The minutes dragged. When breakfast ended, Rachel gathered the dishes quickly and carried them to the sink. Sophie followed her, clutching her sleeve. Linda wiped her mouth with a napkin and left the table without a glance in my direction. The door to her room shut firmly behind her. The house was quiet again, but not the peace of before. It was the quiet of a wound still bleeding. I stood alone in the kitchen, the smell of burnt bacon hanging heavy. I touched my cheek, still hot, and I thought of all the years of swallowed words, all the times I let her voice define me. This morning was the line crossed. My son had seen it. My daughter had seen it. My wife had seen it. I could not erase their eyes. I could not let this be the last image of their father. Something had shifted, something I could not turn back from. And as the clock ticked toward 8, I knew the day had only just begun. As the second hand crawled past the 12, I rinsed my cup and set it in the sink, then wiped the counter with slow, careful strokes. The house had gone quiet again, that hollow quiet that follows a storm. Rachel moved through the hallway, gathering laundry, as if weightless, like a person walking on a stage, trying not to disturb the set. Ethan had shut his door. Sophie sat on her bed, hugging a stuffed bear and watching me with solemn eyes. I told myself to breathe, to move, to drive to work as planned. The driveway smelled of wet concrete and pine. In the truck, I turned the key and stared at the dash until the engine settled into a low hum. Then the memory slid backward like a reel slipping to an earlier scene. It carried me to the day we moved in with Linda 4 years earlier, a blue-gray afternoon right after the funeral. She had looked small that week, smaller than I had ever seen her. She took Rachel's hand and said she could not be alone in the house. We had a place of our own, but the logic felt simple then. Family takes care of family. We packed our lives into cardboard boxes and promised the kids it would be for a while. We told ourselves we were doing the right thing. At first, I tried to make it feel like we were blending two households with respect. For a time, she cried in the evenings and thanked me for mowing the lawn, for fixing the loose cabinet door, for making sure the gutters were clear before the first snow. I remember feeling a kind of hope. Maybe grief would soften her edges. Maybe proximity would build a bridge. It did not. Grief evaporated and control returned like a tide. It started small with a comment about how I scrambled eggs too dry, another about how Sophie's shoes should not be so cheap, another about Ethan spending too much time on math and not enough on piano. She rewrote the grocery list in her tight, slanted handwriting and left it taped to the fridge. Rachel told me to let it go. She is trying, she said. She is old school. Then came the parenting. One evening, Ethan came home with a detention slip for talking back to a teacher. I told him to write an apology note and lose screen time for a week. Linda stepped into the doorway with a frown and announced that boys need freedom to test their limits, that his father would have been proud of his spirit. He seemed grateful and embarrassed all at once. Later that night, I told Rachel we needed to be consistent. She squeezed my arm and said she would talk to her mother in the morning. Money crept into the conversation next. Linda asked harmless questions first. How is work? Are they paying you what you deserve? You must be spending a lot on gas. Then she wanted to know the numbers. She insisted we contribute a larger share to the utilities since the kids were using more water. When I bought Ethan a new baseball glove, she raised her eyebrows and asked whether I had compared prices. She told Rachel that a wise household had one person hold the financial reins and that she had managed her marriage that way for 40 years. I nodded and went for a run in the cold until my lungs ached. Holidays became her stage. At Thanksgiving, she told a room full of cousins that I could not carve a turkey to save my life, and then took the knife from my hand. People chuckled, unsure whether to laugh or look at their plates. On the 4th of July, she stood at the grill while I lit a chimney of charcoal and told a neighbor that men these days did not know how to tend a fire. I kept my eyes on the coals and pretended not to hear. There were private moments, too. When Rachel and I argued behind a closed door about bedtimes or chores or the logistics of two careers, we would hear footsteps hesitate outside the hall. Then Linda would knock once and ask if we had seen the mail, or she would announce that the sprinklers were misaligned. Rachel would sigh and say she is only trying to help. I swallowed my reply because I did not want to make Rachel choose, but the cuts added up. One night after dinner, Sophie asked why Grandma always talked to me like I was a child. I told her that sometimes adults forget their manners when they are sad or scared. She nodded and went back to coloring. Ethan was older and less forgiving. He stopped inviting friends over. He stayed longer at practice and lingered in the garage with me when I fixed the mower or sanded a shelf. Sometimes he would say quietly that he did not like how she talked to Mom either. I would say that we were working on it. Those were the moments that kept me awake. Even with the pressure building, I kept trying to do the right thing. I picked up extra shifts and brought home the good groceries on Fridays. I praised Ethan's grades and sat with Sophie while she practiced reading. I took Linda to her doctor appointments when Rachel had conferences, and I listened to her tell stories about her childhood, about the dusty Iowa farm where she grew up, about a father who never said he loved her, but expected perfection. The morning slap set all of that history on fire. It was not just the sting. It was the public humiliation in front of my children. It was the look in Ethan's eyes and the way Sophie's hands shook. I had told myself that patience kept my family safe. I saw now that patience had taught my children that disrespect was normal if it came wrapped in family duty. I saw that my silence had given Linda a stage and an audience. I eased the truck out of the driveway and watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror. The sun was climbing, turning the roofs of the neighborhood gold. I rolled down the window and let the cold air hit my face, letting the sting of it replace the heat in my cheek. Life moved on with its careless rhythm. At the first red light, I rested my forehead on the steering wheel. I thought about the first month we lived there, the casseroles and the lilies, the fragile kindness we tried to build. I thought about the night Linda told me that men either took charge or they got taken, and how she tilted her head at me as if issuing a challenge. I had taken that as a dare to be the bigger person. This morning taught me that being bigger sometimes means choosing a different battlefield. The light turned green. I drove on past the coffee shop where Ethan and I used to stop after Little League, past the school where Sophie had learned to ride her bike in the empty lot on weekends, past the church where Pastor Allen led the community food drive. I knew what I had to do, and I knew that whatever came next had to be careful and precise. The anger in me settled into something more solid, a resolve that filled my chest without burning. I parked at the site and cut the engine. The sudden quiet felt deep. I sat there with my hands on the wheel and listened to the tick and cool of the truck. I took a long breath and let it out. They had only emboldened the person hurting us. I reached for my lunch pail and the old leather notebook I kept in the glove compartment. I stepped out of the truck, and the chill woke me like a slap from the mountain air. The site trailer sat near a stack of rebar and pallets of cement paint peeling on the door, a dent in the step where boots had landed 1,000 times. Inside the trailer, the heater rattled, and the whiteboard carried yesterday's numbers in fading dry erase. I set my lunch pail on the desk, opened the old laptop, and waited for the fan to settle. I clicked through the folders until I reached the one I had been building in the shadows of our life. It was a directory that looked like any other, but I knew what lived there. Years of things said and done when people believed the walls would keep their secrets. A forwarded thread from Linda to a friend in her church circle. She had bragged about a second property she was renting. I had saved the emails with headers and attachments, screenshots of payment schedules, a spreadsheet that tracked dates and amounts and little notes about who paid on time and who was late. More messages, more casual boasts to different people, each of them a thread in a net she had woven around herself. There were phone photos of receipts, bank deposits that did not match reported income. Even a picture of a tenant's dog on a couch with a caption about renters who never read the no pets rule. To me, it was a timestamp proof of occupancy, more weight on a scale. I had started recording after a night in 2020, when Linda called me a burden in front of Ethan. I went for a long walk that night, and ended it parked around the corner, reading about consent laws on my phone, making sure that what I gathered could stand up if anyone asked where it came from. After that, I used the voice memo app when we were in public places, at family gatherings, or during car rides when she spoke freely. Linda's voice filled the trailer sharp and clear. She mocked Rachel's colleague for gaining weight. She laughed at a neighbor's accent. She bragged about bending rules at work because her position allowed it. 2023. 4th of July, backyard barbecue at Linda's friend's place in Lakewood. I had set my phone against a planter when I went to refill a cooler, the lens catching the picnic table where Linda held court with 3 glasses of white wine behind her. She was radiant with the attention of people who wanted her approval. Then came her proud confession, the one that still made my stomach twist. She told the table she had cut a junior analyst because she did not like his face. She followed with a slur about another employee, casual and cruel, a word that landed like a slap even from the screen. This was the life my kids had been absorbing in small doses. I rubbed my eyes and opened the last set of files. Dates, places, what was said, who was present. March 2nd, 2022, dinner with cousins, Linda told them. I spent Rachel's money. June 27th, 2023, church fundraiser. Linda hinted that she paid most of the bills at home. January 9th, 2024, New Year brunch. Linda corrected Ethan's manners in front of his peers, and then told me boys become men when someone puts them in their place. I closed the log and laid my palms flat on the desk. I pictured Ethan's face at the table that morning, the way he looked at me when the room went silent after the slap. I pictured Rachel unable to pick a side because the ground under her had been shifting for years. I had convinced myself that endurance kept us together. I saw now that it had allowed rot to spread under our feet. Nate stuck his head in hard hat still on. You good man. We are setting forms on the east slab. I need you to sign off on the rebar layout. I shut the laptop halfway with my hand still inside it to make sure the screen went dark. I gave him a steady look and nodded. 5 minutes. He saw something in my face and decided not to ask. I opened the laptop again and checked the integrity of what I had gathered. Each email chain saved with full headers. If I moved forward, there would be no second chance to do it clean. I clicked a blank document and typed a list simple and unsentimental. tax evasion evidence, community defamation and hypocrisy, workplace misconduct captured on video. I remembered the first time I chose to save instead of shrug. It was an evening when Linda told Rachel that real men provide without complaint and that I would thank her later for pushing me. She said it with a smile that meant victory. The look on Rachel's face was one I had never forgotten, a smile of compliance that hid disappointment and fatigue. That night I titled a folder for the first time. Not for revenge, I told myself then. For clarity. For a day when the truth would be needed. I had hoped that day would never come. Then this morning arrived. I shut my eyes and tried to imagine another path, a plea for boundaries that would be respected. I opened my eyes to the reality I had lived. Linda did not yield when asked politely. She yielded only when faced with consequences that touched the image she guarded. Church reputation, professional standing, a sense that she could command any room. If I wanted peace for my children, I had to remove the stage on which she performed. I had to make it impossible for her to keep the mask in place. The cursor blinked at the end of the list. I added one more line. Today. There was no rage in the word, no thrill. Just a decision that felt like stepping from the bank into water that was cold and necessary. I slid the drive from the laptop and tucked it into my shirt pocket. I checked the battery. I closed the lid and the reflection of the trailer window caught me again. A tired man with a red mark on his face and a jaw set like steel. Outside, the wind carried the smell of cut lumber. The sky over the front range had cleared to a hard blue. I walked the length of the rebar grid with Nate and signed off on the work, my pen steady on the paper. He talked about delivery delays, and I nodded in the right places. Every sound, every movement seemed sharper. I could feel the day moving toward a point, as if time itself had chosen a line and invited me to follow. When I returned to the trailer, I placed the laptop back on the desk and opened a browser. The IRS tip page sat one keystroke away in my bookmarks, waiting behind a generic name the way I had left it months earlier, when I could not yet bring myself to act. My fingers hovered above the keys. I thought of Rachel pouring coffee with hands that shook. I thought of Ethan clenching his fists under the table. I thought of Sophie's milk spreading across the wood like a small white river. I thought of the simple truth that children learn what love permits. I clicked the tab and the form opened. I did not type yet. Not here. Not before I checked everything one final time. I closed the tab and rested my fingers on the desk. This was not about humiliation anymore. It was about a line that could not be crossed again. I stood, slipped the drive deeper into my pocket, and reached for my hard hat. The day had a shape now clear and cold. I stepped outside into the sun and felt it on my face where the sting had finally faded, and I knew the next move would carry weight. 9 in the morning crept close as I crossed the yard and climbed the trailer steps again. Inside, the heater rattled. I set my hard hat on the chair, opened the laptop, and brought up the page I had hidden in a plain bookmark, the IRS tip form that asked for facts and nothing else. I read every line before I typed. Name of the person or business suspected. I wrote Linda Thompson and the address of the rental property, the small ranch house in Lakewood, a few miles from our place. I listed the years that mattered, 2019 through 2024. Nature of alleged violation. I described unreported rental income cash preferred patterns of deposits that did not match reported earnings. The form asked if I wanted to be contacted. I selected anonymous, and then I added a line that I could be reached by email if needed, and I typed the burner address I had created months ago when I still thought I would never use it. I attached nothing yet. The form had no place for large files. Instead, there was a field for additional information. I pasted a link to a cloud folder with read-only access. I named the folder in a way that did not point to me, and I included a short index of what was inside. Emails with full headers, spreadsheets of rent dates and amounts, images of receipts, audio recordings from public events where incriminating statements were made. A video captured in July 2023 at a backyard gathering. I added that the recordings were made in Colorado in public settings and that all files retained original metadata. I stated that I was a concerned individual seeking to protect my family and community. Outside, a concrete truck groaned into place and the foreman shouted for a chute. Then I pressed submit. The confirmation screen appeared with a reference number. I wrote it in my notebook with the date and time and underlined it once. I closed the browser and sat with the feeling. Work pulled me out of the chair. Nate met me at the slab with a set of drawings rolled under his arm. We walked the grid, checked spacing, checked cover, checked the dowels, and signed the inspection sheet as the pump truck lifted its boom into the clear March sky. I called for a brake line and watched the crew lay the first mud. During a coffee break, I checked the burner email on my phone. There was an automated message time-stamped 9/22 thanking me for the referral and listing the reference number I had written down. 10 minutes later, a second message arrived from a human address with a signature block that read, "A Carter Criminal Investigation, Internal Revenue Service." The email was brief and dry. It asked me to confirm that the link was mine to share, that I understood the materials would be used in an investigative review, and that if I wished to remain anonymous, I should not include any identifying personal information in the files. It also provided a secure upload portal that the agency preferred over cloud links. I walked back into the trailer and booted the laptop. I copied the folder to a clean thumb drive. Then I opened the portal from the email and entered the reference number. The page accepted the drive and counted up the files one by one. Emails and spreadsheets first, then images, then the audio, then the video. I added a short cover note in the text field, a list of file names and a one-sentence description of each. I checked the box that said I wished to remain anonymous and that further contact should be through the burner address only. When the bar reached 100%, the page produced a receipt. I printed it to a PDF and saved it in 2 places. I sent a short reply to the agent confirming completion of the upload. I closed the laptop and leaned back, feeling the chair creak under me. The trailer door opened and Jorge poked his head in, grinning. "Pour looks good, boss. You want to check the edge before we finish the pass?" I stood, nodded, and followed him out. The pump arced like a crane, and the gray ribbon flowed into the formwork. I walked the edge with a trowel and fixed a spot where the set had gone uneven. By late morning, the sun had warmed the site. I stepped back into the trailer to drink water, and my phone buzzed. Another message from the same agent. Received, it said, along with a short note. It ended with a request that if I had additional context, I should provide it now rather than later. I thought about context. I thought about the morning slap and how quickly anger could move a person to say more than was wise. I kept my reply simple. The property address again. The years again. The note that Linda preferred cash and boasted about it. I added that she had worked as the head of human resources at a financial firm for over a decade, and that she often spoke about her ability to protect herself because of her position. I did not editorialize. I hit send. For a moment, I imagined the files crossing a desk in a quiet office. It would not be fast. I knew that. I put away the laptop and slid the notebook into my bag. When I stepped outside, the sound of the site folded over me again, the shouts, the scrape of shovels, the steady thud of boots on plywood. I walked the perimeter with Nate and talked through the afternoon plan. At lunch, I sat on the back step with a sandwich. I knew nothing would change for them today. But a line had been drawn somewhere beyond our house on paper that mattered to people who kept records. I finished my sandwich and tossed the wrapper in the bin. I checked the time and stood. The first move belonged to the law. The next would belong to the world we lived in, the one that cared about reputation and community as much as rules. I brushed dust from my sleeves and headed back toward the trailer. I pushed the trailer door with my shoulder, and the warm air met me again, stale and humming. I opened the laptop and pulled the drive from my pocket. I made a new folder and copied a tight set of items, the ones that spoke in Linda's own voice. I printed the most telling messages, the ones where she mocked Mary Miller by name, the ones where she claimed Pastor John was too soft to lead, and that someone like her kept the place running. The audio files I prepared separately. I placed them into a FedEx box. I drove downtown. At the counter, I handed it over. Back at the site, I texted Rachel that I would be home on time for dinner. I went to check the formwork at the West Edge. A delivery update said the box had been scanned at the church office. I went back to the drawings and focused on a rebar detail that had shifted half an inch in the plan. Rachel wrote that her group chat from church had exploded. Mary was on the thread, and people were sending her messages full of shock and apologies. Rachel said Pastor John had just posted a short note acknowledging that new information about conduct inside the congregation had come to light and that the church would be addressing it. I replied that I was still on site and asked if she and the kids were all right. Then she told me that her phone would not stop buzzing and that friends she had known for years were confessing that they had felt pushed aside by Linda but had never known what to say. She did not ask me if I had done anything. She did not have to. There was a space between her lines that sounded like clarity and relief and a kind of grief. A new message showed up a few minutes later from a number I did not recognize. It said it was the church office confirming receipt of the materials and thanking the sender for caring about the health of the community. The note said leadership would review and follow their process. There was no ask for identity, only a promise to treat the matter with care. I closed my eyes and felt that small band in my chest loosen another notch. By late afternoon, more ripples. Rachel forwarded me a note from the Women's Council, the group Linda chaired for years. The coordinator announced that Linda would step away from leadership with immediate effect, while the church reviewed concerns and that interim duties would be reassigned. The note was careful and kind, the way churches try to be, but the meaning was clean. The chair that Linda had used as a throne was empty. I imagined her reading that message in our living room, the same living room where she had held planning meetings and written invitations and sent lists. I imagined the quiet that would fall over her like a first snow. Her friends would read the same note, the ones who had laughed at her jokes and nodded along when she drew lines around who mattered. Some would text her cautious, asking if she was all right. Some would not know what to say and would say nothing. Silence has a way of stepping backward from a person when the light shifts. Rachel called when she got a break from messages. I answered and stepped into the trailer to hear her. She said Mary had called her, and they had cried. Mary had always been kind to Rachel. She had been made small more than once by Linda's comments, and had carried the shame in quiet. Rachel said she could hear in Mary's voice the relief of being believed. She told me that Pastor John had asked for prayers and had promised no public spectacle, only steady leadership. Her words came faster than usual, like someone trying to keep balance on new ground. I told Rachel that I wanted the kids to see that adults could face truth without cruelty. I told her that the next hours would be strange and that we could keep the house quiet that evening, no visitors. She agreed. Before she hung up, she said she was sorry for not speaking this morning in the kitchen. I said there was nothing to apologize for. There had been too much noise around us for too long, and the body learns to freeze when it hears thunder. She took a breath and said she understood now what I had been holding. Then someone knocked on her classroom door, and she had to go. The site settled into its end-of-day rhythm. Tools clattered into boxes. The pump folded away. The slab gleamed wet under the last sweep of the bull float. I walked the perimeter and signed off with the foreman. The air had cooled again, and the shadows were long and thin. I checked my phone once more. The group chat remained busy. A couple of Rachel's friends had gone quiet after years of constant commentary. Another mom shared a memory of Linda belittling a volunteer and said she had always felt it was her fault. The line that repeated under different names was the same. We thought it was just her way. We did not want to cause trouble. We did not know what to do. Now they did. The room had been lit, and people could see one another clearly. I packed the laptop and tucked the notebook into my bag. I cleaned the whiteboard and capped the markers. The heater clicked off with a final sigh. Outside, the sky had gone that soft Colorado blue that looks almost transparent. I locked the trailer and walked toward the truck. My body was tired in the good way that comes after work that matters. The package had found its place. The church would carry its part with the slowness and care of a community that knows it must heal without breaking. At the curb, I paused and looked back at the slab, smooth and new, a surface that would cure in its own time. My phone vibrated once more, and I glanced down. Rachel had sent a single line. I see it now. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stood for a moment, with the evening air filling my lungs. The first move had landed in the world beyond our door. The house would feel different tonight, not easier, but honest. I opened the truck door and climbed in, letting the engine turn over and settle, ready to drive into the next stretch of a day that kept revealing its shape. When the light turned green by the park, I pulled into a side street, cut the engine, and opened the laptop on the passenger seat. Time to move. She named a slur like it was seasoning. She bragged about cutting a junior analyst because she did not like his face. I typed a short note to a burner address listed on the site of a local blogger I had followed for years. She worked from public records and on the record voices, and when she made a mistake, she corrected it. I kept my message simple. Video from a public family gathering in Lakewood, July 2023. Recorded by me with the device metadata intact. Subject is Linda Thompson, Head of Human Resources at Summit Financial Group. Content includes discriminatory language and admission of arbitrary firing. I asked that my identity remain protected and that faces not central to the statements be blurred. I uploaded the full file to a clean link that did not carry my name and hit send. Karen answered before I made it to the next light. Need to confirm time and location. I pulled into a lot behind a row of warehouses and typed back. Lakewood, July 4th weekend, 2023. Backyard of a colleague of Linda's named Hal, around 9 in the evening. I added that others at the table had reacted and that I had additional audio from other occasions showing similar language. I told her I would provide it if she needed context for pattern and not an isolated outburst. Upload the audio she wrote. Send any screenshots that tie her to the role at Summit Financial Group. She wanted verification before going live. I attached a short set. A company press release from 2021 naming Linda as head of HR. An audio clip from a church luncheon where Linda joked about fixing an internal complaint by moving a woman to a different department so she would be less visible. Another from a grocery run where Linda mocked a co-worker's English. Karen sent a single line, posting shortly. I looked out at the strip of sky between buildings and listened to the soft rattle of a window unit on the warehouse next door. The anger that had gutted me in the kitchen had cooled into something clean. My phone stayed in my pocket, and I let muscle memory carry me. Karen had posted a 5-minute cut on YouTube with the raw audio laid over the clearest frames and the table guests blurred except for Linda. Comments began in a thin trickle and then became a stream. At 2:40, she posted a shorter clip on Twitter, or whatever name it was wearing this month, and the numbers ran faster. Denver deserves better from leadership. A local reporter asked for permission to embed. A former employee of Summit replied that the culture had been rotten for years and that the video was no surprise. I forced myself to finish the punch list for the day. I initialed the last line on a delivery sheet and pushed the clipboard back to the foreman. Then I stepped into the shadow of the trailer and checked my phone. A text from David Collins lit the screen. He wrote that he had seen the clip, that he had been the junior analyst cut without warning in 2022, and that if anyone needed a statement, he would provide it. I wrote back with the burner email and asked him to send his dates and any written correspondence he kept. He replied that he still had the termination letter with vague wording about fit and a performance file that had been empty the week before the meeting. He thanked me for whatever I had done and said the word finally in a way that felt heavy. By 4, the video had crossed 100,000 views, and the Twitter clip had been retweeted by a Denver anchor with a line about standards. I watched for a few seconds and then put the phone away. The cement would not trowel itself. At 4:30, the calls to boycott showed up in the threads. Clients posting that they would reconsider contracts. People asking why a firm that handled money and lives would allow leadership that disrespected both. Karen pinned a comment under her video reminding viewers to avoid harassment and to report discrimination through proper channels. The tone of the room shifted toward action. I checked the time and felt a line inside me about to tighten again. Ethan would be getting out of practice. Sophie would be at the table with crayons and a glue stick. Rachel would be closing her classroom and looking at a phone that would not stop shaking in her hand. I sent a quick message to Ethan asking if he needed a ride. He wrote back that Coach was dropping him near the house. I told him I would be home soon. At 5:30, I cleaned up the desk in the trailer and slid the laptop into my bag. I stood for a moment and listened to the muffled sounds outside, the slam of a tailgate, the laughter of men who had lifted and poured and smoothed until the surface lay like a lake. Then I stepped out into the evening. My phone buzzed again before I reached the truck. Karen had posted an update, a short follow-up with a timeline and a link to a public page with Summit announcements that placed Linda at the head of HR for the last 4 years. She had added a note that she had reached out to the firm for comment. The note ended with a simple line. More to come as verified. The thread beneath it grew with each refresh. Stories of interviews that had gone nowhere after someone higher up made a call. Stories of complaints that stalled and then disappeared. Stories from people outside the company who had been told they were not a fit in rooms where their names were mispronounced. At 6, the clip climbed into the top trending list for Denver. My phone showed a screen full of blue and red bars. I sat in the truck without turning the key and let the weight of it land. This was not joy, and it was not vengeance. It was the sound of a system that had been humming in the background for years, finally being heard by more than the people crushed under it. I thought of Linda sitting in her chair, reading the comments, watching her reflection in the black mirror of a screen shiver. The light outside thinned to that silver hour where the city softens. I gripped the wheel and felt the small shake in my fingers ease. The steps I had taken were out in the world now. The church had its truth. The law had its files. The city had its video. There would be noise in the hours ahead, maybe calls, maybe a knock, maybe nothing yet. I drew a breath and let it out slow, then turned the key and watched the gauges climb. The tires rolled over gravel. As I pulled onto the street, the radio still off, the evening stretching in front of me, like a narrow road that knew exactly where it led. I called out that I was home. Rachel was at the stove stirring a pot. Ethan asked if we were okay. Sophie asked if Grandma hated me. I said that sometimes people act out of fear and habit, and that the way Grandma spoke was not love and not acceptable. I said that I would keep them safe and that in this house respect was a rule like any other. Rachel turned the burner low and wiped her hands on a towel. I could feel the space between us holding all the words we had not said. I dried my hands and helped Sophie arrange forks and napkins. Rachel served plates and kept her focus on the food. Ethan asked for the garlic bread. Ethan asked again if we were okay. I told him we were okay because we were together, and because we were going to fix what was broken. I said sometimes adults take longer to learn than kids do. Sophie asked if Grandma would have to say sorry. I said we could not control anyone's words but our own, but we could decide what was allowed in our house. Rachel said her phone had been buzzing all afternoon, and that the church would be handling things, that people had been kind and honest. Then she asked carefully what else I had done. I told her that I had sent something to someone who could put a light where it needed to be. I said that what mattered was that the behavior that had been hidden was now visible, and that this house would no longer be a stage for it. Rachel said she was scared that making it public would tear the family in two. I answered quietly that the plates had already been crashing, only we were catching them with our hands and bleeding in silence. I said our children had watched, and that they needed to see us choose respect over avoidance. I told her that silence is not peace when it teaches people to accept harm. Rachel looked at Ethan and Sophie, then back at me. She said she did not want them to lose a grandmother, that grief is not a switch you flip, that once you go public, there is no taking it back. She said there would be fallout at school and church and work. I said we would hold them through it. I said I would shoulder what came. I told her I wished we had not needed today. The tension in the room tightened the way a rope tightens when two people pull in different directions out of love. I told Ethan to clear the plates with me. We stood at the sink and passed dishes like teammates. He said Coach talked about leadership today, and that it sometimes looked like moving first when everyone else froze. I said that sounded right. He asked again in a low voice if Grandma hated me. I said I did not know what she felt, but I knew what her actions had done. I said feelings mattered and actions mattered more. Sophie tugged Rachel's sleeve and asked if she could have ice cream. Rachel laughed once, a small bright sound, and said maybe later. She put a hand on my back as she moved past me to the pantry. When the table was clear, Ethan went to his room to finish homework, and Sophie set up a game on the rug. Rachel and I stepped into the small backyard and stood under the string of lights we had never bothered to plug in. The evening had cooled, and the smell of tomato sauce followed us out. Rachel folded her arms and looked at the fence. She said she had dreamed so many times of a quiet life where no one had to pick sides. She said she knew that was a fantasy, but she wanted to hold on to some softness for the kids. I told her softness without boundaries becomes a kind of fog where people get lost. I told her I would not raise them in fog. She asked if I was sure this would not make Linda worse. I said things often look worse when you stop pretending, but after that, they can get better. I said the kids needed to see that their parents can draw a line and keep it. She said that made her feel safer and more scared at the same time. I said it made me feel the same, and that I would not move without her. We stood there with our hands empty and our shoulders close, not touching, not pulling away. From the kitchen window, Sophie called that her glue had dried, and her dragon skin felt like armor. That made Ethan laugh as he walked down the hall. Rachel wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. She said she would try to trust the ground we were standing on. She said, if Linda pushed tonight, we would not argue in front of the kids. We would state the rule and step away. I said yes. We went back inside and started the dishes. The water ran hot and steady. Linda's door stayed closed. The house held its breath but did not collapse. I felt the press of the day in my bones, and I felt the calm of action settle in. The argument between Rachel and me did not disappear. It sat between us, acknowledged, not poisonous. In the living room, Sophie held up a paper crown for inspection. Ethan had joined her game for a minute, and had cut a crooked crest that made her grin. I sat on the couch and watched them, and for a long moment the room felt like early summer, the way light lies differently when school is out. Rachel leaned on the doorframe and let out a breath she had been holding since morning. We did not talk about what would happen tomorrow or the day after. We did not pull the future into the room. We let the present be a place to stand. When it was time for homework and showers, we moved through the motions without commentary. Sophie sang in the bathroom, and Ethan shouted that she was wasting hot water, and she shouted back that dragons like steam. Rachel smiled and shook her head. I checked my phone once and set it face down again. The night had its own speed. We would meet it where it was. I pulled into the driveway. Linda's door remained shut. A banner slid across the screen with the name Summit Financial Group and the words Public Statement. The company had placed Linda Thompson on temporary suspension while it conducted an internal investigation into matters raised earlier in the day. There was no defense. Rachel's face went still as she read the same thing on her phone. She reached for the remote. A video from a community source had circulated, the anchor said, and the firm at the center had acted. Ethan asked what was happening in a voice that tried to sound casual and failed. I told him his grandmother's company had taken a step they take when there are serious questions and that adults were working through the facts. Sophie asked if this meant people believed what they saw. I told her people were listening. The reporter said that comments had poured in from current and former employees. David Collins appeared. He said he had been cut as a junior analyst 2 years earlier without a performance record to support it, and that the video had put shape to what he had felt but could not prove. He held up a letter with his name and the date. Then the anchor repeated that the firm had suspended its head of human resources and that the investigation would be independent. Karen had posted the statement and linked to the firm's page. People wrote that the behavior sounded familiar in their own workplaces. Some wrote that they had filed complaints that vanished. Others asked how to report discrimination without losing their jobs. Karen pinned a list of resources and reminded people not to dox and not to threaten. A business columnist posted that the incident raised questions about governance at the firm. A civil rights attorney wrote that hostile environment claims are not just about slurs, but about patterns of decision-making and power. A woman I did not know shared a story of an interview that ended with a joke about her hair and a note from a recruiter that read, "Not a fit." Her line that followed landed like a nail set with a hammer. We were told to take it as the cost of entry. Rachel's group chat lit again. Mary wrote that she had turned off her phone for an hour and cried and then turned it back on. She wrote that she felt lighter. Other women from the church added messages sore with memory and relief. A younger teacher wrote to Rachel privately that she had once volunteered with Linda and had gone home sick after being mocked for not knowing a hymn. Rachel read those messages with a still face. She looked at me, and the look carried years of pieces snapping into place. From down the hall, a muffled ringtone began to rise and fall, then another, then silence. Linda did not come out. I pictured her chair, the way she always placed her phone in a neat square on the table, the way she held it like a badge. I could feel the glow of the screen behind that door, as if light could leak through wood. Somewhere in the house, the heat kicked on, and the vents clicked as they woke. Another push alert hit my phone. The Denver station had posted a longer article online. They included the company's statement, Karen's video with a content warning, and 2 anonymous quotes from employees about a culture of fear. The last paragraph said the firm had engaged an outside law practice to conduct the review. I read it twice, then closed the tab and set the phone face down. Ethan came to the edge of the kitchen and asked if we were in trouble. Not school trouble, he said, but the kind of trouble where people pick sides. I told him that people would have feelings, and some would be loud, and some would go quiet, and that our job was to be the same people we were yesterday and to keep our rules. He asked if Grandma would lose her job. I told him I did not know. I told him this part belonged to the company and to the truth. He nodded and went back to the rug where Sophie had built a castle of paper crowns and index cards that looked sturdier than it should. Rachel rinsed a glass and set it on the towel. She said she had wanted for so long to believe that her mother's harshness was just stress and grief and old habits, that it would ease in time, that if we were patient, the years would sand down the sharp edges. She said the video and the statement and the voices had stripped away the story she kept telling herself. She said I had been right to stop the slide. She did not say the word right as a prize. She said it like naming a street after you realize you have been walking in the dark. I made tea for the 2 of us while the kids finished homework. The kettle whistled and the steam fogged the little window over the sink. We carried the mugs to the couch. Rachel sat with her feet under her and her back straight. She asked quietly what would happen if Linda opened her door and tried to turn the house back into her court. I told her we would keep our voices low, we would say our rule once and we would not argue. I told her I would not step into an old pattern where she hurts us and we act like it is weather. My phone buzzed again, a direct text from David with scans of his termination letter and email threads with HR. He wrote that he was sending them to the reporter as well. He added that he was moving past anger and into something else. He said he did not have a word for it yet. I typed back that he was not alone and that the right people had the files. I left it at that. The evening settled into a rhythm of small noises. Sophie laughed at something Ethan drew in the margin of his book. A neighbor's car door thumped shut across the street. A dog barked and then quieted. The house felt like it had been tipped and set back down straighter. The past did not disappear. It stood in the same rooms with us, but the light on it had changed. Rachel silenced her phone and rested it on her knee. She said she did not want to hate her mother, that she did not want the kids to learn hate as a language. I told her we would not teach them that. I told her we would teach them boundaries and repair. She said she could live with that. She reached for my hand and pressed her fingers to the back of it in that small way she does when she needs to remind herself that something solid is still here. A final alert came from the station with a teaser for the late news. They would recap the statement and run part of an interview with David. I turned the TV off. We did not need more screens. The children brushed their teeth and drifted toward their rooms. Rachel stood and gathered abandoned crayons and a glue stick and the paper crown that had become a helmet. She placed it on the shelf like a fragile trophy. Behind the closed door down the hall, a floorboard creaked. Footsteps paused, then moved again. The air pulled tight for a second and then loosened. I breathed in and let it out slow. The world outside had chosen its angle on the story and would carry it into the night with or without us. In our house, the next moment would not be on a screen. It would arrive in the shape of a person stepping into the living room, and we would meet it with the words we had promised to say. The four of us stayed without saying it out loud. Rachel sat on the arm of the couch, with her hands clasped. Ethan stood behind the chair, with his elbows on the back, and Sophie hovered close to my side with her paper crown tucked against her chest. The knob turned. The front door opened. Linda stepped in with the careful movements of someone walking on ice. Her face was washed out, and her mouth pressed into a thin line that kept trying to become a smile and failed. Her phone glowed in her hand and then went dark. When her eyes landed on me, the mask cracked. She said this was a setup, that I had poisoned her daughter, that I had dragged our name through mud. Her voice rose and bounced off the ceiling. She told Rachel to speak sense into me and told the kids to go to their rooms while the adults talked. Rachel did not move. Ethan did not step away. Sophie's fingers tightened around my sleeve. I stayed where I was. I told Linda we would not raise our voices in this house. I said we would speak once and we would keep our words clean. She laughed without humor and said clean was a word people used when they were weak. She waved her phone at me and said lawyers said defamation said I would regret this day. I told her the video showed her own words, and the church had her own messages, and the rest belonged to the places that would handle it. I said we were talking about our home and our children and what was allowed here. Rachel said this morning could never happen again, not in this house, not in front of our kids, not at all. Linda blinked at her daughter as if light had changed color. She said Rachel was ungrateful that I had turned her against her own blood. She said the world outside was vicious and that family must circle the wagons. Ethan spoke then, not loud, not disrespectful. He said Grandma had said things that were not okay and that he did not want to hear anyone talk to his dad like that again. Linda's anger faltered. It turned in on itself and left something more raw behind. Her shoulders sank. The hand with the phone lowered to her side. She said she was sorry if things were misunderstood. She said she had been under pressure. She said grief had made her sharp. She said she could change. Her eyes shone and tears collected without falling. Rachel held one palm up in the small signal we had agreed on outside under the string lights. She said we needed space. She said the apology could not erase today or the years that led to it. She said we would not have that scene in our kitchen again. Linda began to cry openly now. She said if it would calm the house, she could leave for a few days, she could stay with a friend, she could check into a hotel near Colorado Boulevard. She said she did not want to lose her grandchildren. I stepped forward one pace and kept my voice even. I said she had crossed every line. I said she no longer had authority here. I said tonight she would pack what she needed and give Rachel the address where she would be filmed. I said tomorrow we would talk about how to make the separation clean, and that until then there would be no debates in front of the children and no scenes in shared rooms. Linda searched my face for softness and found none she could use. Rachel did not move. She stood beside me and put her hand on the back of the chair where Ethan leaned. She said the internet lies. She said video can be edited. She said the pastor had always had it out for her. She said the company would realize their mistake and issue a correction. She said the world loved to tear down a strong woman and that I was helping them do it. The clock over the stove ticked in the quiet. The heater clicked and then settled. Linda took a breath that caught. Rachel spoke gently. She said not tonight. She said she would pack. She said she would take only a suitcase and her briefcase and the cosmetics from the upstairs bath. She said she would be back for the rest when we were calm. I said she should text Rachel with the address and the name of the hotel and that there would be no unannounced returns. She turned and walked down the hall. We listened to the sounds of drawers opening and closing. The zipper on a suitcase rasped. Hangers scraped a closet rod. Ethan stood straighter and let his hands fall from the back of the chair. Sophie slid her fingers into mine and leaned her head against my arm. She stepped closer and said, "We had done what we promised." She said she was scared of the next days and relieved in the same breath. I said I knew. I said the rules were simple and we would keep them. He nodded and sat on the rug. Linda reappeared with the suitcase handle extended and a leather briefcase strapped over her shoulder. Her eyes were red, and her hair had loosened at the temples. No one moved to meet her. She told the kids that she loved them. Ethan said, "Thank you," in a voice that was polite and distant. Sophie did not speak. She turned to me and tried one last angle. She said she hoped I understood that this would not look good for me, that people would blame me for breaking a household. I told her the household had been breaking for a long time, and that our children did not need to see more splinters. I said goodnight, Linda. She rolled the suitcase down the hall. The front door opened. The door closed. We stood in the living room without speaking. The kitchen light cast a warm rectangle on the floor. Ethan sat on the rug with his arms around his knees, staring at the crown Sophie had set between them. I could feel my pulse in my wrists, steady and strong. Rachel came to stand next to me. She leaned her shoulder into mine. She did not speak. She did not need to. In the silence that followed, we heard the faint drag of the heater turning on again. The vents breathed. The house seemed to settle into its frame. I told the kids we were going to keep things quiet tonight, that they could finish homework, and then we would read in the living room. Sophie asked if she could sleep on the couch. Rachel said we would see. Ethan stood and stretched and said he would help with dishes. I stacked plates and turned the water to warm. Rachel dried and put things away. Ethan wiped the table with slow circles. Sophie flipped through a book and read a line out loud every few minutes, her voice soft and steady. We let the quiet fill the rooms and did not rush it. Rachel tucked Sophie into the corner of the couch with a blanket, and Ethan opened his laptop to finish a worksheet. The dishwasher hummed low. A few minutes passed and Rachel's phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up and read a short message, then showed me the screen. A hotel on Colorado Boulevard, a room number, and a note that said she would be reachable there. I nodded. The rules we had set were holding. I walked down the hall to our bedroom and opened the top drawer of the dresser. Under the folded shirts sat a metal box the size of a book. The key lived under the tray where I kept old ticket stubs and a single cufflink. Inside were the things that matter on paper. Birth certificates. The kids' immunization cards. The policy for the car. The title insurance folder with a county seal in blue. I laid the stack on the bed and slid out the deed. The notarization stamp sat heavy in the corner. The date read 2015. I carried the folder to the living room and set it on the coffee table. Ethan and Sophie looked up at the shape of the papers as if they were a puzzle. Rachel stood with one hand on the back of the chair. I told them I needed a few minutes without the TV, without background noise. I said this house was bought years before Grandma moved in with us, and that the deed had carried my name alone since that day. I slid the paper toward Rachel, and she leaned over it, reading silently. She looked up at me with a mix of shock and something like relief. She said she had always assumed the house was in both our names after the refinance a few years back. I told her the refinance never closed because of a snag with the appraisal, and that we had decided to wait. I told her that when Linda came to stay after the funeral, we were all living inside a storm, and none of us reached for paperwork. Sophie crawled closer and put a hand on my knee. She asked what would happen now. I told her the truth without decoration. I said we had stayed in a situation that was hurting us because we believed patience would fix it, and that patience had not worked. I said I was going to sell this house, and that we would find a place in Austin where Grandma could not control our rooms, and where we could set our own light. Rachel's mouth opened and then closed. I said I had been thinking about it since last year. In quiet moments, I did not want to admit to the times when I watched Ethan avoid bringing friends over the nights Sophie pretended to fall asleep early so she would not have to hear sharp voices in the hall. I said I had a former foreman in Austin who had called me in January about a project starting this summer, and that he had asked if I would consider coming down. Ethan sat up straighter. He asked what his school would be like and whether he could try out for the baseball team there. I told him Austin had fields that stayed busy year-round, and that he could try for anything he wanted. I told her we would find out together. Rachel pressed her palms together and rested them against her chin. She said Austin felt far, and she was suddenly measuring distance in a way she had not done in years. Schools and pediatricians and a piano teacher who is gentle and exacting in the right measure. I told her houses sell 1,000 times a week in this country, and that ours would be one of them, that I would shoulder the listing and the calls and the showings, that she could keep the kids steady while I handled the traffic. She looked at the deed again and then handed it back to me. She said she did not want to live as a guest in a house where we were hosts. She said she did not want to live in a city where every Sunday brought a new performance of a story that was not true. From the hallway, a floorboard gave under a shift in weight. A shadow moved along the line of light under the door to the guest room. Then the door opened halfway, and Linda stepped into the doorway with her coat over her arm and her suitcase propped against her calf. She had her hotel key card in one hand and the spare house key in the other. She said she was leaving the key on the table, her voice small and formal. She said she had texted the address. She did not cross into the circle of the living room. I picked up the deed. I held it at my side and met her eyes. I said the house was mine and had been since 2015. I said I would be selling it and moving my family to Austin. I said this was not a negotiation and not a punishment. It was a boundary and a plan. Ethan looked from me to Linda and then back to me. Linda blinked twice quickly, as if dust had gotten into her eyes. She started to speak and could not find a word. Her mouth closed. She looked past me at the deed on the table and then at the children and then at Rachel. Linda's shoulders sank. She said she had things in the hall closet that she would collect another time. I said we would set a time when the kids were at school. She looked like she might say she was sorry again. She did not. She looked like she might say this was unfair. She did not. She looked like she might call me weak or cruel. She did not. She chose silence because there was nothing she could claim in the room. She walked down the hall and her footsteps were small. The front door opened and closed. Rachel let out a breath. Ethan looked at me with a steady gaze I had not seen from him before. Sophie climbed into Rachel's lap and tucked her head under her chin. I put the deed back into the folder and the folder back into the stack. I did not put the box away yet. Ethan asked when we would tell the school and whether he could finish the spring season with his team. I told him we would make sure he could. I said we could drive and find the biggest dragonfly on the way. Rachel stood and came to my side. I walked the papers back to the bedroom and returned the box to the drawer without locking it. There would be new papers soon, a listing agreement, an offer, a contract, an escrow timeline. In the living room, Ethan pulled a map app on his phone and traced a line south and east. Rachel opened the calendar and stared at the weeks ahead, as if she could see the shape of the move settle into them. We woke into a stretch of weeks that felt like a steady march. There were showings and signatures and small repairs that made old corners look new. The realtor walked through with a clipboard and a calm voice, and I found myself painting trim at midnight, while Rachel labeled boxes in neat, careful handwriting. Ethan carried armfuls of trophies and sneakers to a stack near the door, and Sophie packed her stuffed animals with the ceremony of a museum curator. In the mornings I went to work, and in the evenings I took calls from a foreman in Texas who kept a spot open for me on a crew starting in early summer. Neighbors began to linger on sidewalks with dogs that suddenly needed longer walks. They waved and asked if we were really leaving Denver and where we were going and when the sign would change to pending. A couple on the corner who had always waved from a distance stepped closer one Saturday and said they had heard things and hoped we were okay. Rachel thanked them and said we would be fine. She did not offer details. Linda returned twice to collect boxes from the hall closet and the guest room. We arranged times when the kids were at school, and I kept the visits short. On the second pickup, 2 of her church friends arrived on the sidewalk at the same moment. They spoke to Linda in hushed tones. One asked if she should call someone at the church council. The other mentioned a prayer circle. Linda looked at me and then away. She said she had everything she needed and that she would be going. The women turned their questions toward Rachel, as if the story could be softened by a different narrator. Rachel kept her answers plain. She said the kids were well and that we were moving. She did not invite them in. By the time the appraisal cleared and the inspection items were closed, the house had lost a layer of itself. There were dents I had not noticed, and sun-faded squares where pictures had hung for years. The kids slept in rooms lined with boxes like towers. They counted down to the day we would drive south, and they marked it with small dots on the kitchen calendar. At dinner we talked about things that made Denver home and things we looked forward to in Austin. Ethan said he would miss snow on the driveway in the early mornings before school, and he said he wanted to learn to hit a curveball year-round. Sophie said she would miss the flutter of magpies over the park, and she asked if summer storms in Texas made better puddles. On a clear morning late in April, we met at a title office with a view of the mountains. The closer had a calm smile and a stack of papers with flags marking lines for signatures. We signed and we initialed, and we passed the pen back and forth. When it was done, she shook our hands and slid a small envelope across the table with the wire confirmation. Rachel looked out at the long line of the Front Range and swallowed. She said the city had been good to us and hard on us, and that she hoped we had been good to it. We drove back to the house for a final walk-through. Neighbors waved again. A pair of women from Linda's circle stood by a trunk and spoke in low voices. We walked through the rooms and touched the frames and the door handles and the edges of counters. Ethan stood in the empty garage and flicked the light switch 3 times. Sophie ran her palm along the banister. We locked the door and handed the keys to the agent. Rachel tucked a small envelope into my jacket pocket. The kids climbed into the back seat with pillows and headphones and a bag of snacks. We pulled away from the curb and the house slid behind us. The highway opened and the city dropped behind. We stopped for lunch at a diner with a counter that ran the length of the room, and a waitress who called everyone honey. Sophie counted trucks by color, and Ethan looked up baseball fields in Austin and told me which parks had fences set just right for left center. We pulled into Austin 2 days later under a sky. The rental house sat on a quiet street with live oaks leaning over the roof and cicadas starting up in the trees. It was smaller than the place we had left, and it felt lighter the moment we opened the door. There were bare floors and clean walls. We set down boxes. I reported to the site the next morning and met a crew that shook my hand and told bad jokes in the way men do when they are welcoming you into their circle. The work felt the same as it always had. Ethan found the public field near the high school and threw until his arm loosened. Then he asked the coach how to try out for summer ball. In the first week, he made a roster spot on a team that practiced at dusk, and I watched him track a fly ball into the pocket of his glove. Sophie met a girl on the block who rode a pink bike with streamers, and by Saturday, they had invented a game. Rachel found a grocery store she liked and a coffee shop with quiet corners where she could grade and breathe. We called my foreman from Denver to tell him the start had gone well, and he told me the slab back home had cured just right. News from the old life arrived. Linda sent one message through Rachel in late May with a new address and a request to see the kids at a public park when we visited Denver someday. Rachel said we would consider it when trust had been rebuilt. There were no arguments and no theatrics in return. The quiet held. At night we sat on the small back porch and listened to the thrum of insects. The kids chased a pair of pale green dragonflies. Rachel leaned into my shoulder and let the day run off her like water. Work days found their pace. The site ran from 6 to 2 in the early summer heat, and I came home covered in dust and concrete haze. Rachel began to sleep through the night again. She woke with a softer face. I thought about Denver without bitterness. The city had given us years of good, and it had shown us what we could not live with. I thought about Linda less often as days gathered. What filled the rooms now were the small sounds of people at peace with one another. On April 30th, 2025, the wire closed at noon Central, and the realtor called to say the transaction had recorded. The house we had left belonged to someone else, and the future we had chosen answered back with a simple yes. We took the kids for tacos that night. Ethan told a story about a pop fly that went up into the white and came down into his glove. Sophie told a story about a lizard that had visited the porch steps. Back at the rental, the air held the heat of the day like a blanket. We opened the windows and let the ceiling fans hum. I stood in the doorway of the kids' rooms and watched them sleep the way their breathing settled into the same slow rhythm, despite their different sizes and lives. In the quiet, I let myself believe I had done what a father is supposed to do. I had moved my family out of a room that was hurting us and into a space where the ground was ours again. I brew coffee while the house wakes at its own pace. Ethan clatters down the hall hunting for a cap that he swears he left on the counter. Sophie pads into the kitchen with a book tucked under her arm and asks if dragonflies like sugar water. Rachel opens the window and lets the warm air in. We move around one another without flinching, a family in motion, no one bracing for a voice that cuts. The ordinary has weight again. It brings back years of nodding and swallowing and saying later. It brings back the morning when later ended, and I understood that silence had turned into permission. I had told myself I was protecting the people I loved. I was teaching them that harm wears a familiar face and must be tolerated. That lesson ended the day I chose to act. It changed the direction of the years that came after. I think about what silence was for me and what it is not. It is not cowardice when it is the space you use to gather courage and proof. It becomes weakness only when it hides a fear of standing up. I had been quiet for so long that my own voice surprised me when I finally used it. When I did, I spoke once each time and let the right people carry the rest. Law where law belongs. The weeks since we left Denver have taught me how healing likes to arrive. It arrives with kids who fall asleep easily because no one is fighting in the hall. The peace we found is the steady hum of a life without a lie in the center. People ask me in small ways if I regret the way I acted. They mean the day I took the records out of the shadows and put them where they belonged. I do not regret it. I regret the years I thought endurance alone could fix what had broken. I regret the mornings when I told my son that being a man means taking it without adding the words. Taking it is not the same as letting it continue. I regret the nights my daughter learned to make herself small so she would not be noticed. She sends updates through Rachel that are simple and devoid of theater. Boundaries are what we keep. Her company chose to investigate, and it will conclude what it concludes in its own slow way. The choice to stop living under a shadow matters more. There is a difference between punishment and consequence. Punishment wants pain. Consequence wants truth. On this porch, I can say plainly what I would tell anyone who recognizes pieces of our story in their own life. Keep your records. Out of respect for your future, know your laws and stay inside them. Speak once clearly to the right door. Do not stage a scene. Do not trade one cruelty for another. When you feel that urge to explode, picture your children or the part of yourself that is still a child, and ask what lesson you want remembered in the quiet after the noise. I would also tell you that help comes from places you do not expect. A blogger who values verification over speed. A coworker who kept a letter because his intuition told him he might need it one day. A pastor whose voice softens when he admits he missed what was right in front of him. A neighbor who offers to take your trash bins to the curb without asking why you look tired. None of these people fix your life. They make it easier to do the work of fixing it yourself. There is a moment that returns to me whenever I wonder if we did the right thing. It is a smaller moment in a kitchen that no longer belongs to us. Sophie put a hand on my wrist with glue on her fingers, and I felt the gentle weight of trust. She knew her father would choose her peace over his pride. That was the line I followed out of that house and into this one. She did not need me to win a fight. She needed me to end it. Ethan taught me something too. He stood behind a chair and said what was not okay in a voice that did not shake. I had spent years thinking that leadership meant absorbing force. He reminded me that leadership sometimes means standing still so the storm breaks against you and loses interest. He watched, and he learned, and he went to practice, and he ran until his lungs burned, and he came home and did his homework. That is what moving forward looks like. Rachel has her own kind of courage. She loved her mother, and she loved me. She wanted a soft landing for our children, and she wanted hard lines where harm stops. I watched her breathe easier and remember what a room feels like when you do not have to check every corner before speaking. If you are listening to this and your house feels like ours once did, let me say this plainly. Kindness is not the same as surrender. Gentleness is not an invitation to be stepped on. Silence is not weakness when it is the place where you gather yourself for the right move. The day will come when action is the kindest thing you can do for the people you love. When it comes, do not wait for someone else to make it for you. Choose it and then live with the steadiness that follows. I do not pretend that our story fits neatly into a box. What I know is that a single day can tilt a life toward a better horizon if you are willing to touch every hard thing it asks you to touch. Sending the records to the law was hard. Putting truth in the hands of a community was hard. Looking a person you once tried to please in the eye and saying no more was hard. Each choice made the next one simpler, not easier, just clearer. Clarity is a gift you open over time. If this story gave you a measure of that clarity, stay with us. Like if it helped you breathe a little easier. Subscribe if you want to hear more true accounts of standing your ground in rooms that tried to take it from you. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that kindness does not equal weakness, that patience does not equal permission, that a quiet voice can change the shape of a day. Carry those lines with you into your own rooms. Let them guide your hands when you reach for the door that leads you out. Tonight the porch hums and the kids sleep, and the city settles around us like a friend. I sit with the sound and the air, and the knowledge that I did not have to become someone else to protect my family. I only had to become the person I promised them I would be. The rest is ordinary, and it is enough.